Good afternoon, colleagues and non-members of the East African Law Society. Welcome to today's webinar that will take us approximately 2 hours. That will take us approximately 2 hours. I see we had around 341 members who had signed up for this webinar. Without much ado, I would invite the East African Law Society representative, Praise God Joseph, to make her opening remarks before we proceed with today's webinar. My name is Jacqueline Ngutia. I'll do further introductions when my time comes. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Jacqueline, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining this webinar. As introduced, my name is Praise God Joseph. I'm an advocate. And I would like to say thank you for participating. Society aim is to legal professional practice, EAC, among our Sorry about that. As I was saying, the ELS, in collaboration with the BHR committee, saw it prudent to organize this webinar aimed at ensuring that we create an area where our members can engage in an interactive discussion to see how we can understand the global economy, understand how businesses and companies are growing, but also how to ensure that as companies and businesses are growing, they also look into the other side on how they can ensure that they implement human rights standards in their practice. And without further ado, I'll proceed. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Madam Vice Chair, for the introduction. And now we can proceed and state what we are expected to state now that ELS has officially welcomed us to this session. Today's webinar is on technology and digitization, a business and human rights analysis of opportunities and limitations in supply chain management. Please, at the chat box, tell us about yourself, introduce us, tell us where you're coming from or you're joining us from. And we also have a chat box where you can participate in the dialogue by sharing your insights. We also have the Q&A section. Please ask your questions as we move on. And we also have the reactions icon at the bottom of the Zoom screen. You can always feel free to raise your hand or use the necessary emoji, appropriate emoji for this webinar. Colleagues, my name is Jacqueline Ngutia. I am an advocate based in Kenya. I work with the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights as a regional coordinator. The commission is a constitutional commission whose mandate is to protect and promote human rights within the private and public spheres within the Republic of Kenya. And the commission, in collaboration with the Office of the Attorney General and Department of Justice, spearheaded the development of the National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights that speaks to implement the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. You will hear more about the same in today's presentation. So as a country, the action plan was adopted by the government as sessional paper number 3 of 2021. The contents of the action plan is available at the KNCHR's website. Previously, I worked with the Advocates for International Development, that is about 7 years ago, and we were working towards popularizing the UNGPs among lawyers in Kenya and within the East African region. So I'm also a member of the East Africa Law Society Business and Human Rights Committee, and I'm particularly happy to just see the demand of knowledge and practice, how it has grown over the years, and I'm happy to moderate today's session. So as you're all aware, colleagues, is that supply chain involves a number of suppliers, subcontractors, including members of the informal sector, and often we see vulnerable people, especially women, poor persons, marginalized, and child laborers affected by supply chain management within not just Africa, but also in other parts of the world. In addition, we have seen the advancement of digital technologies such as Internet of Things and artificial intelligence promoted within the spaces of supply chain management. And with this, we have experienced human rights risks such as privacy concerns and lack of internet, especially for the vulnerable persons. We've also seen risks associated with algorithm discrimination and digital identity issues. So the reason why the East Africa Law Society felt it was wise to hold this webinar is because of the new and emerging issues, the globalization of business across different sectors. Often they span between different countries, and we also understand the geopolitical context within which this supply management operates within the different legal, regulatory frameworks and the different human rights practices across the world. And ILO has reported around 450 million workers work within the supply chain related work. So it's an area of interest for lawyers, not just as suppliers in the context of legal services, but also as businesses, because I know most law firms do engage in supply chain management when you then subcontract other agencies to provide services or goods within our workplace. So it's a two-way traffic. So at the global stage, we have seen framework developed, and today we'll focus more on the United Nations Guiding Principle on Business and Human Rights that provides an authoritative, international acceptable frameworks that enhance standards and practice regarding business and human rights. So we have lined up eminent speakers with wide experience in application of business and human rights concept. Our first speaker is Ms. Nasaga Aki, a senior consultant at IBIS Consulting. She's an environmental, social, governance, and impact advisory expert. That is what IBIS ordinarily done, and has had 8 years experience working on business and human rights matters in the NGO and private sectors. Her experience spans in various sectors, including retail, agriculture, pharmaceutical, healthcare, information technology, finance, infrastructure, renewable energy, and others within Africa and Asia. Ms. Aki will speak to us about analysis of human rights situation in the supply chain globally and within the East African region, and how supply chain is linked to the realization of human rights. So allow me to welcome Mrs. Aki Nasaga Aki to make her first presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Moderator, for the introduction. I'm really delighted to participate in this discussion which I think is timely given the fast evolving context in the business and human rights space in Africa. And I believe all of you will agree with me that Africa is a resource-rich continent. And by that fact, it holds the resource key to a lot of supply chains globally. I would say almost all supply chains globally. And I'm sure in the recent times you have heard of terminology like Africa is the new economic frontier and so on. And what that does is that it places Africa in the center stage of the global investment agenda. But I think the question that we really need to interrogate is whether these investments are they harming us more than benefiting us, or is it vice versa? You have had concepts around the paradox of plenty in Africa, the resource curse of in Africa. Should we still be talking about this? Because they always speak to violations of human rights within the supply chains in Africa. And I really think this topic is not spoken about more often than it should be. And really, I would just want to extend my gratitude to the East African Law Society for organizing this. And I hope there'll be many more in the coming days. So as has been mentioned, I'll be taking you through the discussion on the human rights situation in the supply chains globally, and then narrowing down the focus to East Africa. And here I would want us to cover the key issues emerging from the human rights situation in the supply chain, as well as the challenges that are experienced. Not just stopping at that, but progressing to discuss what progress has been made so far in protecting human rights within these supply chains, and what role does technology play in this respect. And I think as a good starting point for the benefit of some of us who are first interacting with the discussion of the supply chain, I think we can start by this defining what a supply chain is. And I would put it simply as the entire network of entities as well as processes involved in the production of a product. And this is from the point where it's a raw material until it gets to the final consumer. So we can pick an example, for example, the tea supply chain. Here we'll be looking at the cultivation point where the farming and the harvesting is done. Then we go to the processing and the packaging, the distribution, retail and consumption, etc. If we were to talk about another supply chain, say mining, we would be talking about the exploration stages, the extraction process, the transportation, refinement of the minerals, and going to the distribution and eventually to the end user. And in all these processes, human beings are involved. And the moment human beings are involved, human rights are triggered, because human beings have human rights just by the virtue of them being human. And you will usually find that they will either be negatively impacted or positively, the human rights will be negatively or positively impacted throughout these processes. But as a hard and fast rule, in the human rights space, we say that none of the supply chain players should be harmed. And I believe in the subsequent discussions, you'll hear my colleagues speak about the do no harm principle in business and human rights. Like I had mentioned, we as Africa, we hold the key to most of the supply chains, but you will find us most of the time playing at the lower levels of the supply chains, mostly at the primary level, and sometimes just going slightly up to the secondary stages. And this is mainly because of lack of infrastructure development, which limits how much we can go in processing some of these products. So that's why you will see something like cocoa is planted in Africa, I think Ivory Coast does 38% of all the cocoa in the world. And you'll see it being processed. The first processing will be done in Africa, but subsequently, for you to get your chocolates and so on, it has to be done in most of the times in the global north. Yeah, you see things like palm oil. The oil is the palm oil trees are planted here. They are harvested here. The first processing is done here. But when it comes to it being used, say, in the cosmetic sector or in the food and in the food processing sector, you find it has to go outside Africa. But that just is to describe how we are quite limited in terms of the stages that we play in the supply chain. The tertiary levels, you will always find they're being, the participants are outside of Africa. And one thing that I would want us to know is that the lower we go in the supply chain, the higher the human rights risks. Again, I'll go to an example like cocoa farming, which is one of the supply chains where you'll find a lot of child labor, a lot of occupational health and safety issues, the respiratory diseases, a lot of deforestation. So the lower you go in the supply chain, the higher the risk. If you compare it maybe with the processing stage, which is mostly semi-automated, the human rights risks tend to decrease. So that is why in our discussions, we really have to focus at the lower levels where the human rights risks are higher. And now I would want us to narrow the discussion to the East Africa context. Like we said, we are players at mostly the lower levels. The key supply chains that I would say are in East Africa, in my opinion, they are agriculture, and in most of our countries in Africa, we say that agriculture is the backbone of our economy, understandably so, because we are blessed with rich soils and good temperatures, which favor agriculture. So you have your tea, your coffee, your palm oil, cocoa, horticulture, and so on. There's also the mining supply chain. Here we are talking about the metals and minerals, as well as oil and gas transaction. The third one, this is arguable. We have the textile and garment sector. It's quite a silent one, but it's quite a big player where we have ourselves mostly producing garments for the fast fashion and the designer clothes that are usually sold mostly in the European countries and some in Africa. There are very many human rights risks that are associated with these supply chains. And just to guide our discussion, I would want us to use I would have wanted us to use 2 case studies, but I think would be quite constrained in terms of time. So I will limit it to 1 case study, but encourage you to read about the other. So the case study that I would want us to discuss is of Feronia Incorporation, which is a palm oil company in the DR Congo. And I would particularly want us to discuss this one because in my opinion, it's a good case study because everything wrong that could possibly happen in a company in terms of protection of human rights was happening in this country, in this company. The other one that I would want you to read about is Kakuzi PLC. In the interwebs, there's a lot of information about human rights violations that were associated with it. But back to Feronia, a palm oil producer. I mentioned earlier that palm oil is used largely in the cosmetic sector as well as in the food processing industries. And in Feronia is one of the biggest employers in the DR Congo, as well as one of the biggest revenue earners for the government. And it impacts quite a big population in the DR Congo, around 10,000 employees, as well as a community of around 100,000 people within a 5-kilometer radius. Feronia is a very profitable company, and this would be evidenced by the fact that we've had big shots in the investment space. That's the European development institutions, around 4 of them running to invest in Feronia. We had the Belgium and Britain and Germany and the Netherlands development financial institutions investing there. But what's interesting about Feronia is that it's a company that was not respecting the basic human rights. There were a lot of human rights violations, and just to get more information on this, I would encourage you to read the report by the Human Rights Watch. I think it's called Dirty Investment. It will give you more details about this case. So violations that were witnessed there included unsafe working conditions for the workers. You had the workers being exposed to toxic pesticides, hazardous materials. Some of those hazardous materials have actually been banned by the WHO. And so they were resulting in a lot of illnesses, skin irritations, eye infections, respiratory infections, and so on. And these workers were also not being provided with any protective equipment. There was a lot of unjust labor practices and abusive employment practices whereby the minimum wage is not complied with. There's people working excessive hours, delaying payment of their wages, a lot of labor casualization, forced labor, sexual and gender-based violence. The list is really endless. There was deaths that are happening there, people being brutalized both by the police attached to the company as well as private security guards of the company. I would not even start speaking about the environmental degradation that was resulting from the operations of the company, where they were dumping the wastewater in the only water source that the local communities were relying on. And really, I would say it was a case of, I would say this in Kiswahili, mgeni njoo mwenyeji afe, and instead of mwenyeji apone, it was mwenyeji afe. And really, this is the script that we see in most of the human rights, in most of the supply chains in Africa. When you read about Kakuzi, you will see that it's mirroring the same human rights issues. And I believe at this point, most of you would be asking yourselves, where was the Democratic Republic of Congo government amidst all these violations that were happening to its people? I mean, they have the obligation and the duty to protect their citizenry against the violations. You see, different things, different scenarios usually play out when it comes to protection of human rights within the supply chains. You'll have instances where there are no laws in the country, or the laws that are available are insufficient or do not sufficiently protect the people. Another scenario, you will find that there are laws, but the enforcement is very weak. And this was the case in Feronia, whereby there are laws, but there are weak enforcement mechanisms, contributed to by a couple of factors. One, corporate capture. Really, Feronia was running the show, and it was the biggest revenue and one of the biggest revenue earners for the government, and the government would not want to tamper with it. There's issues around lack of sufficient resources to implement some of the laws. Sometimes you will find there is corruption or lack of political goodwill. And sometimes it's just a case of refusal to implement judicial decisions. You'll find that in such instances, the judiciary is usually the last man standing when it comes to protection of human rights, but then the executive refuses to implement some of these decisions. So it becomes quite a challenge, or some of the private actors also refuse to do that. It becomes a big challenge. There are mechanisms that people would usually use in the international sphere, but the challenge that it presents is that some of these channels are not accessible to the communities. And in some instances, the communities also do not know of their existence. And sometimes they lack the financial muscle to get to access these channels, say to hire a lawyer to represent them in the regional courts. again, the issue of refusal or reluctance by the government to implement decisions from some of these fora also becomes a challenge. I would even use the case of the Ogiek case. It's not a business and human rights case, but it's just to illustrate how you can get a good decision from a regional court, but the government refuses to implement it many years on. So then what happens in such circumstances where we have weak enforcement mechanisms? Over the years, I have noticed a trend, and I believe my fellow practitioners will attest to this. Usually, you will find protection of human rights is mostly controlled by whoever has the money. And because most of the times we are exporting from our supply chains, and we're exporting to the global north, you will find that the investors or the consumers in the global north sort of dictate what they need to happen in the supply chains. And I think the supply chain players, as well as the governments in the global north, have noticed these weak enforcement mechanisms of human rights in the global south. And so they have taken upon themselves to come up with some mechanisms to ensure human rights enforcement. One of the things that you will notice with most of the investors as well as consumers in the global north is that they fear reputational damage. That's their biggest nightmare. And so they will do whatever it takes to ensure that there's human rights compliance. On the other hand, you'll find the raw material producers as well as the processors and exporters, because they need the money and they need the market, then they will be forced to comply. So it's a give and take situation. And understanding this, I've seen most of the NGOs now are taking advantage of this. And whenever there are human rights violations, they will instigate consumer boycotts and reputational damage, mostly on social media and other avenues, against the violating companies. And sometimes they also target their investors and through what they call the cancel culture, boycott this, boycott this. And seeing that the investors really fear this, then they would not want to engage with this company. So the company would be on a losing end. And this is really what happened to Feronia. After the Human Rights Watch report, we saw a lot of the investors divesting from the company because of the human rights violations. Other trends that we've seen going on is that the EU is really developing a lot of obligations on its juridical citizens as well as their suppliers to comply with human rights. And lately, I think you've seen the European Union deforestation regulation, as well as the corporate social due diligence directives that have been established. And what these do, they require a risk-based system to monitor and prevent as well as remedy human rights and environmental damage. So they really require people to go back and ensure that there are no human rights risks or human rights risks are mitigated within their supply chain. And in so doing, we are even seeing some companies or some supply chains developing or using blockchain technology to trace their supply chains. Some of them are even using GIS coordinates to locate farms where the farmers are planting, and with this information, they are able to contextually assess the human rights risks in those places and develop mitigation measures. Other mechanisms that we have seen, recently I was doing a supply chain risk assessment of a garment company in Jordan, and there were cameras. The company had mounted cameras where one of their consumers, a big fashion brand, was real-time monitoring the workers' labor and working conditions there. Are they clocking in on time? Are they being forced to work excessive hours? So that's just one of the ways, some of the ways that we can use technology, or the trends that technology is being used in protecting human rights. Other ways that we have seen is there is, this is not necessarily linked to technology, But we've seen a lot of, especially countries in the global north, placing extraterritorial human rights obligations on investors, as well as multinationals that are operating in the global south countries, whereby the parent companies can be sued in case of human rights violations of their subsidiary operating in the global south. And for this still, I would refer you to the case of Kakuzi, where Camellia PLC, the parent company of Kakuzi, was sued in the UK for the violations of Kakuzi in Kenya. And the list is endless. The innovative ways of protecting human rights, they keep evolving with the situation. So the list is endless, and I would not want to belabor the points. I think I will stop at this point, also in the interest of time, and take it back to the moderator. Thank you very much.
Wow, thank you. Thank you so much, Aki. Thank you so much for the presentation. You have shared with us how Africa is considered the land of plenty. Yet when it comes to issues of supply chain, we are usually playing at the low level. You have shared instances where we have human rights violations, agriculture, mining, textile and garment. Cases that you have highlighted, the Kakuzi in Kenya and Foronia in DRC. And for me, I think while we're moving on with the discussion, is that did we have lawyers in all this? And what is the place of lawyers? I know we will have that discussion when we get there. The use of technology, what a number of businesses have done, use of blockchains, GPS coordinates, CCTV cameras. I think those are innovative ways within which companies are ensuring that they do protect human rights. Our next speaker is Patrick Karanja. He's an advocate of Kenya with over 18 years experience. He's currently the Project Lead Africa for Advocates for International Development, which is a UK-based global charity. He coordinates the Business and Human Rights Program within East Africa. In addition, he's a member of the East Africa Law Society Business and Human Rights Committee, a member of the Law Society of Kenya Public Interest and Legal Aid and Human Rights Committee. He's also an alumni of the Youth Encounter on Sustainability and Alliance for Global Sustainability. Patrick will share with us the normative framework protecting human rights within the global supply chain and how responsible supply chain management in the digital era is an enabler to the state in its fulfillment of its role of ensuring human rights are protected and issues around realization of SDGs. And what are the limits of supply chain responsibility? And I know this would be great for lawyers when you're advising our clients on issues of the limits of supply chain responsibility on areas of subcontracting or value chain. Welcome, Patrick.
Thank you, Madam Moderator, for the opportunity to share my views with my colleagues. And because I've been asked to provide input on something that would better be demonstrated with talking points, allow me to share my screen just to provide a highlight on some of the issues I want to share. I believe you can see my screen.
Yes, we can. Please proceed.
Yes, thank you so much. So I'm looking at the topic of today, which is technology and digitization, and giving it a business and human rights spectrum, so that we analyze what opportunities are there and what limitations are there in supply chain management. And for me, then to ask what is our role as lawyers in ensuring that we support our our clients, whether we are commercial lawyers, whether we are lawyers working in law firms or in-house counsel, or working for government and regulators, what is our role in ensuring that we have business and human rights standards in supply chain, and looking at supply chain from a perspective of the whole chain, from think of any gadget you have, including whether it's your mobile phone, whether it's the clothes to wear. It goes through a long chain of stakeholders from the time it's a raw material to the time it gets to the consumer as an end product. And if you look at most of the supply chain, you realize that many of them have different tiers of suppliers and stakeholders, many in different jurisdictions. So the question is, under what law would you hold the supplier or the business liable? Is it under the national law? And what happens when some part of the operation are outsourced in another jurisdiction? So then this brings the complication in terms of there being multiple jurisdictions where different businesses in the supply chain are based. And then the question would be, what law is a multinational or an organization or a company going to apply as it implements its own internal policies on what is its obligation for human rights? And from an international perspective, from an international law perspective, to start with is to say that there is no binding international law for businesses and supply chain. So most of it is governed by soft law regimes. And we can trace this back to the International Bill of Human Rights, both from the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, the ICCPR, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the International Covenant on Economic and Social Cultural Rights. And then the question obviously that traditional comes up is, what does this have to do with business? If these are international obligations, states are the primary duty bearers in terms of human rights. And I think then the global trend and the global framework on responsible business is then informed by other areas of soft law, all non-binding, including various conventions under the ILO, which stipulate whether it's about decent work in the supply chain, then also for the UN system, whether this is guidelines under the UN Global Compact, which is a covenant between CEOs on what would be acceptable standards. And of course, then in different regions, we are aware of what is happening in the EU in respect to the corporate sustainability due diligence. And also in Africa, we have conversations on developing policy on business and human rights. But for me, and looking from the example in the EU, in addition to having these international frameworks, where the rubber meets the road is in-country implementation, where the harms occur. Whether that would be in a country like Kenya, even though the business in Kenya would be part of a supply chain, the question comes, where do you hold business liable for its human rights impact? Let's say, for example, you have a supplier in a village in one area of the country who is supplying a middleman or a producer who then exports that product in another jurisdiction. How do you hold the company, let's say in the EU, accountable for violations that would have happened somewhere in the supply chain? And of course, when these conversations come up, the issue of subcontracting and subsidiary relationships come in. The multinational will say, well, from as far as we are concerned, this was not our operation. We outsourced this to another company in another jurisdiction. So ordinarily, we should not be held to account in our own country because it was not our operations. And to reconcile this difference in international frameworks and different legal systems, then the soft law system informs the ethical standards that from where I sit, then should inform the national legislation, because it's from the national legislation, then you're able to better have enforcement. As we might be aware, it takes a long time for an international treaty to become binding and to be negotiated so that it can have a force of law. So it is therefore important when you're looking at the framework on responsible business in a global supply chain to look at it not only from one perspective, but from various perspectives, both from the international law perspective, from a soft law perspective, what are the guidelines, what are the values, what are the ethical business practices, then also from national legislation that countries then need to adopt these to make binding regulations in their jurisdiction. And we've seen this increasingly in the EU, where you have different due diligence, mandatory due diligence regulations, legislations being enacted. Then in addition to this, there is industry practice. For example, each supply chain would have its own industry, whether it's the garment, whether it's the agricultural production. Those industries can develop industry standards that then guide companies and stakeholders in developing their own policies. And again, then another advocacy tool is the emerging trends of the civil society and consumers asking companies that they need them to be responsible and be accountable for how their goods are produced or how their services are delivered, so that the responsibility of the global supply chain is multifaceted, if you like, requirement that you don't have a one size fits all. And therefore, as lawyers, it's a good opportunity for us to interact with the international framework, know our local laws, understand our industry, where our clients are, look at the emerging global trend, and then be able to advise the businesses we engage in. And if we are part of the regulators, to make sure that in our jurisdiction, then we develop sufficient framework for accountability of businesses, both the businesses in our jurisdiction, but even the businesses in the supply chain. As I indicated, in terms of soft law, we have the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which sets the three pillars, and the first pillar being the state duty to respect human rights, that yes, it is the duty of the state to respect human rights, but also corporates have a responsibility to ensure there's a respect for human rights. And when there is an adverse impact of business on people or community, then there has to be an effective remedy. So the UNGPs provide a good framework to be able to guide businesses and supply chains in terms of what is expected of them. We also have the OECD guidelines and various international labor organization standards. And of course, as I've indicated, many countries then would adopt their own duty of vigilance or due diligence or modern slavery acts to ensure that they have enforceable due diligence legislations in their countries. And looking at the UNGPs, this being a business and human rights forum, as we are aware, we have three pillars, and the first pillar, which is under guiding principles 1 to 10, is on the state duty to protect human rights. Then we have guiding principles 11 to 24, which elaborate then what is the corporate responsibility to respect human rights. And as lawyers, and in many of the business and human rights trainings we've had, it's obviously come out clearly that lawyers will need to update ourselves in terms of what are the UN guiding principles, and then take these conversations to our corporate clients so that they can also understand what is expected of them in terms of respecting human rights. And I would like to point out two main guiding principles, and this is guiding principle number 13 and guiding principle number 17 of the UNGP. And guiding principle 13 stipulates that the responsibility of business enterprises, first of all, to avoid they themselves causing harm or contributing to adverse human rights impact, and also to seek to prevent and mitigate any adverse human rights impact that may be directly linked to their operations. And this means even though this human rights risk is not in the business, then the business should think beyond its own operation to the other businesses in its supply chain, so that they ensure that they help to prevent and mitigate any adverse human rights impact from their supply chain. And guiding principle 17 then require businesses to develop human rights due diligence framework, so that they can actively identify potential human rights risks and be able to ensure that those are put in their operation, so that human rights due diligence should be part of the management strategy of a business, to show that it is aware of the risk it's likely to cause through its own operation or operations of its businesses in its supply chain, and then also to see what are they doing to ensure that they address those potential risks. Then in terms of supply chain management, there's a move to leveraging on IT and digitization. And this does not exempt also the supply chain management, where many companies are now developing solutions to help them track what is happening in their supply chain. If you look at digitization of a supply chain, there are three components. First of all, there's a software developer who develops a solution for the business to have oversight or manage the supply chain. Then there's the technical support people who install and manage these and then engage with these in day-to-day. Then obviously there are the businesses themselves and the end users. So the question is, can we, using digitization and all these blockchain and IT solution, what is the place of human rights? How do we ensure we embed human rights in the digitization process, so that we ensure that it is not only process, but also people focused? And for me, even though there are many benefits of digitization, which include that, I mean, if, for example, there's an operation in part of the supply chain, people can be able to text if there's a harm happening, and you can be able to easily access information. It also enhances traceability. You can know this gadget I'm using, where each of the components came from. But as you know about technology, mainly if you remember the principle of garbage in, garbage out, it means in the development of the technology to manage the supply chain, we need to be careful that we embed human rights consideration. Otherwise, we'll have monitoring tools that are not really reporting on what is happening or the real impact on the people. And of course, then there are those concerns about privacy and data protection, cybersecurity, and how do you ensure, for example, if I'm in part of a supply chain where I'm supplying various companies, and each of them is giving me standards and apps and operation, I could be granted to a halt. So how do we ensure, even as we leverage on digitization, that there's more collaboration, so that if I'm supplying to various importers or various businesses in the supply chain, that they have a somewhat standardized or similar approach, that I do not need to reinvent the wheel every time I need to report. Then obviously there are concerns about state sovereignty. Is this Western world talking down on African countries? Can the standards for human rights due diligence be used to disproportionately disadvantage suppliers from different countries? How do you deal with the informal sector, artisanal mining sector? How do you ensure that even as we digitize, it does not actually exacerbate some of the discrimination that technology can bring? And for me, as I indicated, at the end of the day, all this framework makes sense when we interpret them in our countries. How do we anchor then these in our constitution, in our local legal system, in our legislation, in our Companies Act, in our industry standards, in our regional discussion, whether it's in East Africa or in Africa? I'll give an example of Kenya. We have a very progressive constitution, and also a very progressive Companies Act. So for me, the call for lawyers in this forum is to think, yes, there is this international framework. Yes, there are these industry-based practice, but how then do we localize them? And I think the conversations on UNGPs are localized by adopting the national action plans on business and human rights, which have identified some of the critical areas that require local solutions. And interacting with the implementation of the national action plan, then we can support policy and legislative reforms in our countries, even leveraging on what is there, but also developing other laws to ensure that we have stronger business and human rights landscape. And as I indicated, for example, in Kenya, our constitution recognizes a person to include the company, and also it gives our courts the power to purposively interpret the constitution to apply the Bill of Rights. And I think for me, this opens an opportunity for us as lawyers to consider strategic litigation to move our human rights courts to purposively interpret our constitution to create more framework for business and human rights compliance in our countries. If we look at the Kenyan Companies Act, for example, as well, it sets out obligations and duties of the director, which includes that the director has a duty to foster the company's business relationship with suppliers, customers, and others, clearly addressing the issue of the supply chain and the place where the Kenyan companies sit, and the obligation of the director of a company in Kenya in terms of how they should be responsive to the supply chain, and also putting the community and environmental consideration at the center. So finally, looking at solution, of course, even the most well-intended framework, things always go wrong. So for me as lawyers is to think, where do we come in? Whether we are litigation lawyers, how do we ensure that we properly equip ourselves with knowledge on business and human rights so that we can be able to proactively advise businesses and communities, but more so when there are adverse impact that we can be able to support businesses, communities, and individuals to be able to access remedy. And with that, I am very grateful for the time, and I look forward to engaging further in the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Patrick, for your insightful presentation. You have shared with us the normative framework at the international and regional level, and it seems a lot of work has been done at the EU level. So as advocates beyond international, regional human rights instruments, then we can always look at sector-specific standards and emerging global trend. We have the OECD standards. We also have the UN Global Compact. You have mentioned the recent BEPI, the United Nations guidelines on business and human rights. And if I am not wrong, it's only Kenya within the East African region that has developed the National Action Plan on implementation of the business and human rights. So your presentation has really built up in Aki's presentation on the weak enforcement mechanism that has seen businesses go scot-free when they do violate human rights. So thank you very much. If you have any questions, participants, please let us have them at the Q&A section. So our next speaker is Ms. Rebecca Wangui, a partner at Ashford and Company Advocate. She has intense experience on human rights due diligence. I remember when I started off at FOID, I would engage commercial lawyers on business and human rights, and majority of them would tell me, please, we are not human rights activists, go away. But there's been growing momentum in the area of human rights due diligence, how advocates are expected to advise their clients. And Rebecca will speak to what is human rights due diligence. And if you look at the supply chain, it's a complex process with a lot of processes. How would procuring entities, both states and non-state agencies, be in a position to infuse human rights best practices in the processes? And how would the human rights due diligence in supply chain look like? That would be very key for lawyers. And lastly, would also want to hear from you. What are the likely disadvantages and limitations of undertaking human rights due diligence within the supply chain? So welcome.
Thank you very much, Madam Commissioner. I hope I'm audible enough. And
Yes,
thank you
you are.
also for the, okay, thank you. And thank you also for the participants who are in this particular webinar. And just to join what Madam Commissioner has reiterated, the area of human rights has not been a very acceptable area of practice within lawyers, I may say so. And I remember back in the day, because this is an area that I've actually like taken more of my passion side on. And I remember especially, and this is not to cast any person, but most of these big law firms never saw the need for human rights. So somebody would just be looking at my resume and say, okay, so how does human rights butter our bread? I'm very happy today because more and more there has been a lot of conversations, and there'll be a lot of duties, a lot of spaces for anybody who has the heart, has the passion for exercising and practicing human rights in globally and locally. This is one of the big area, and I'm so relieved to know that indeed human rights is actually part and parcel of legal practice. Like Madam Commissioner, Ms. Jacqueline has mentioned, mine is to just talk briefly about the human rights due diligence in supply chain. As a caveat, I would like to say that this is a very technical area, and perhaps what you normally see on paper is not exactly what it is, because there are a lot of technicalities. So on the onset, I would also want to talk about, we are looking at supply chains mainly from a global perspective. Our first panelist spoke about, how we have the global south, who are predominantly the main buyers, and a lot of production, a lot of the storage, and a lot of transportation happening in Africa. And so when you look at that, I would want to just be able to set the context on which we are speaking about, because as you all know, and if most of the people on call are lawyers, due diligence is contextualized in different areas. You have contract law, you have all that. So in this regard, I'll just set my presentation in 5 parts. I'll just have a brief session on definitions of the key words that we are looking at and the key terminologies within my presentation. And the second session will talk about what exactly is human rights due diligence, and I'll speak about the key 4 components that are required to have a proper human rights due diligence. Of course, as an in-house lawyer, of course, as a lawyer within a law firm who has the responsibility to mainstream areas, the area of business and human rights within the law firm and their contractors and their outsourced contractors. And then, of course, briefly speak about why human rights due diligence, responsibilities of the states, corporations, and also suppliers. Because as I want to take away, one of the key takeaways of this is that it is not supposed to be a top-down approach, where now, for instance, the buyers, the people who actually now maybe, for instance, buying that refined tea, as Aki used the example of tea production. So we're not looking at perhaps a country that consumes a lot of tea being able to push down some of these requirements onto the suppliers, maybe predominantly because maybe our tea is grown in Africa. So we are talking about a situation where it's collaborative. And then I'll end with advantages and limitations of challenges of implementing the human rights due diligence. Well, on the onset, I know my panelists have spoken about the topic, but I think it's important to refresh and remind ourselves what human rights are. And it's important to know that these are definitely the universal rights that we have, because we are simply human beings, and they're inherent to us all, regardless of your religion, your ethnic background, your color, your language, and any other status. So when you now combine that, you'll be able to know why we're talking of the due diligence. In the context of supply chain, as Ms. Jacqueline has mentioned, that mine is to speak around the supply chain. The due diligence terminology, or rather the concept I would like us to concentrate on, is the exercise or the process of identifying the human rights risks that are involved during the whole supply chain process. And this due diligence, the exercise of the process, is supposed to prevent and mitigate human rights risks, thereby reducing them. And the key areas that I'll speak about, I will mention, is around the assessing, the planning, remedial or corrective action that may be taken as a result of the assessment that perhaps an in-house lawyer or a lawyer who's mainstreaming business and human rights within a law firm or corporations will be looking at. And of course, in this context, also when you're talking about due diligence, we're talking about the audits that perhaps companies take, the audits that perhaps if you're a law firm and you're contracted by a company to do this. And of course, there'll be a lot of work because, as you know, there's so many state obligations and state contracts that are between the states and host companies. And therefore, for instance, if you're a lawyer or if you're a law firm that has been contracted to do the job, you'll be looking to do a lot of audits right from the beginning of the contracting process. So it's also important to know that here you'll be talking about the companies that you hope to engage with and being able to obligate them to provide as much information so that you may understand all the risks that will be involved in a particular transaction or whatever the transaction or whatever the investment would be. There is also the definition around what supply chain. Aki and Patrick have mentioned around what it is that we are looking about. We are talking about in terms of supply chain. But of course, for me, I'll just also segment it into three parts. So we are looking at the physical flow. And here we're talking about the logistics, the movement and the storage of goods, for instance, if it's tea that we're talking about. And then we're talking also of the information flow, and the information flow being the brain that will make the physical flow work. So this, we're talking about the database, how information is stored, how documentation is stored. That is also part of the supply chain. We're also talking of the financial flow. Financial flow could be, let's say it's Kenya or it's Uganda or it's a country. It is exporting their cash crop. If it's tea, it's coffee, it is cocoa in Ghana, and they are exporting that product to Europe or to America or whichever country. Of course, as you can see, there'll be the financial flow here we are looking at is also, we are looking at the complex and the very many currencies that are involved. So if it's Kenya, there's a shilling. By the time it gets to Europe, perhaps whichever country, if it's the UK, you'll be talking of the sterling pound. If it is other European countries, you'll be talking about the euro. So the supply chain, we're looking at those three components: the physical flow, the information flow, and the financial flow. So what is human rights due diligence? As I had retaliated earlier, it is the process or the exercise that identifies, prevents, mitigates, and accounts for how to address violation of human rights, averting negative impacts among human beings and businesses. I would like to mention that there is no human rights due diligence in the world that can avert all risks. So here, what we are talking about as lawyers, as relevant practitioners in every area around human rights due diligence, what we are talking about is just ensuring that we have an enforceable, acceptable standard within our organizations in relation to any transaction or interventions or investments. So we are not looking at, and there can never be a perfection or a perfect framework. We are looking at what is acceptable. For instance, when you are exporting, when the buyer, for instance, in Europe is exporting tea, and this tea right from the ground, it is being harvested by somebody, a woman, for instance. Are we talking about child labor? Are children involved, for instance, in harvesting this tea in its raw form? So during that whole process, what we are looking at is that exercise that helps us be able to mitigate, to first of all identify them, assess, identify, mitigate, and see what are the remedials, basically trying to remedy some of these risks. Of course, it's also about being able to provide the services and goods within the supply chain. That's the reason why we do and we conduct the human rights due diligence. The four elements, we do have four elements of the human rights due diligence process, and I had alluded to them earlier. And that number one, for instance, if you're a lawyer, if you're contracted, you're a specialist, and you're supposed to conduct due diligence, you'd first of all have to assess actual and potential human rights impacts within, for instance, whatever transaction you'll be doing. Maybe you've contracted, maybe the transaction is between a state and a company, or it's between two companies, or it's between an individual and a company. The number one component of the due diligence is to have a baseline, be able to assess and be able to see what are the actual and the potential human risks we will be looking at. Number two, we have the second component, which is integrating and acting upon the findings. So here we'll be looking to see, after we have assessed, after we have identified the human rights risks here, how do we now tackle them? So it then means, for instance, if you're a company embarking on this particular exercise, you'll be looking to put in finances, set aside finances, so that you can be able to address some of these risks that may occur or will occur during your supply chain process. And of course, the number three element of a good human rights due diligence is also the tracking responses. So you'll be looking to see, for instance, you'll be looking to ensure that you have very collaborative communication channels with your suppliers, because one of the things we'll also realize is that we do not give these obligations or expect that the suppliers are the ones to oblige. No, what we are saying that it is no longer a top-down framework. We are looking at everybody within the supply chain, within the supply chain, doing their part. In this case, if it's the buyers buying the final product, and if it is the suppliers, they also have a role. They have a role to play. Of course, there is also the fourth component, and that is at the second component around integrating and act. There you're supposed also to prioritize the most severe actions. Like I said, you cannot really have a perfect framework, but you should be able to prioritize what are the key things that are likely to advance the human rights here. If it is workers, for instance, look at the key things that need to be addressed, that need to be mitigated, that need to be addressed, and put in also some resources around that. On the component 3 around the tracking, of course, you need to, you'll have different suppliers along the way. You may not just have one supplier. So you always have to be able to track. You always have to have assess new suppliers, for instance, during the tendering process. And also this is able to avert, for instance, maybe risks that, for instance, were not there before, but maybe because of change over time, something has happened. So it is a continuous process. It is not a one-off. So when you're saying you're tracking and monitoring, it has to be a continuous, regular exercise that you do embark on. And the number 4 component, which is very critical, I had alluded, is the communication with stakeholders. Here we are talking about the suppliers themselves. You must be able to be transparent. For instance, if you're a buyer, be transparent around what you expect, your expectations. The state also must be able to communicate the expectations with the companies, or rather private companies, that they're engaging with. And that continuous communication, the stakeholders, the suppliers or the companies, they will be able to relay their challenges. They'll be able to also openly discuss and bring forth what they feel could be risks, and thereby mitigating them by perhaps maybe offering forms of support like financial support on how to avert that. And of course, why human rights due diligence? Aki and I think Patrick, they both alluded to that. It is around being able to protect the reputations of companies, because when you do that, then of course you are at the top chain, and many companies, or many even the states as well, they'll be able to know that you do observe and you do protect human rights. And so that's very key. It is a protection of your brand as well, and also it avoids corporate legal risk avoidance. So it is also avoids a lot of legal actions that could be taken against a corporation or a state in that matter. And also, of course, there is also the aspect of compliance. Where when you're able to do the due diligence, you also you'll be in a position to comply with the requirements and also the applicable laws. I was also supposed to speak around the responsibility of procuring entities within the supply chain. And in this case, I'll, for instance, take the example of the state, for instance. All businesses, either by the state, its agencies, private or public entities, all of them bear individual and collective responsibility to protect human rights. So this is not just one entity within the supply chain having the responsibility. It is rather individual, and at the same time, it is collective. I think that's very important to note. And how states are able to, their biggest responsibility, we know that within the human rights sphere is that states are the primary duty bearers under the human rights, international human rights law. They are the ones who are supposed to ensure that we have frameworks, that we have the legal frameworks, we have the policies and the accompanying regulations in protection of the human rights. Therefore, we'll be looking for them to develop, implement those policies. And we've had some of, and Patrick has alluded to them, we do have some of the due diligence laws that have been implemented out there. For instance, modern slavery is a big thing where we are finding not slavery in the way that we used to think about it, but in the context of our the current world. So you'll find countries like New Zealand, United Kingdom, they have enacted like the Modern Slavery Act, just trying to look at, for instance, whatever products they are receiving on the other end, whether there has been forced labor, whether there is child labor implication, whether there is human trafficking involved as a result of the end product that is now being consumed by their audience. We also have the EU Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. That is also a framework that has been, as a result, developed as a result of due diligence laws. And also we have California Transparency in Supply Chains Act. Yeah, so states should encourage and where appropriate require human rights due diligence by the agencies themselves and by those business enterprises or projects receiving their support. So it is very critical, for instance, if a state is contracting with maybe a corporation or a private company out there to express their expectations in regard to protection of human rights. So there must be some level of commitment, and the contracting companies must be able to see that in the documentation. It may not be a whole framework of what human rights look like, because we do have so many instruments, legal instruments, international, regional, and national that touch on human rights, but rather basically just having that expectation lined up. In terms of companies, of course, I've already alluded that they must have a human rights due diligence process. They must be able to carry out audits. And one of the things that you realize when companies do this, the responsibility to their suppliers, what they normally do, once they're able to do that, and once they're able to collaborate with the suppliers, they'll be able to understand how the key challenges that are being faced by the suppliers. They'll be able to help them, support them where they can. They'll be able to raise awareness. So it is actually a mutual, it's a mutual collaborative effort. And that really helps, because then, for instance, the people in the global, in Africa, for instance, that are producing some of these products, providing labor for the same, do not feel like they are being looked down upon, or their sovereignty is interfered with. Well, one of the things that we also need to understand is that traditionally, the legal requirements of the buyers are pushed down to the legal requirements of what the buyers need to observe were pushed down to the suppliers. So this is a very big departure, where we're looking at not just the suppliers being able to observe that within their factories, for instance, they do have workers' rights, that they are supporting a thriving union among the workers, that they're providing a conducive environment for the workers to work in their factories. But it's also the buyers, what we have, the responsible buyer buying practices. So we are looking at buyers as well. And buyers in this context I had mentioned earlier, we're looking at, for instance, these big companies already in the West being able to consume the final product, which predominantly come from Africa. So if you're looking at it from that context, so we're not just looking, for instance, if it is Adidas, we'll not be looking at them looking down on where the raw material came from in Africa, if it's the leather or whatever form of raw material is required for the shoe, but we're looking at Adidas having the responsible buying practices that also mesh and work together with the suppliers' obligations on the ground, what we call the mutual obligations. Now, as I come to the conclusion, I really want to mention and emphasize that this is a very technical subject, and I cannot do justice, or any of us cannot do justice within 15 minutes that we've been given, but I think it will allude to some of the insights that we need to be looking out when we talk about human rights due diligence. Coming to the advantages, of course, when you conduct a human rights due diligence, definitely you're going to protect and you're going to preserve the rights of other people. So if you're the buyer out there in the West, you're looking to see that you haven't had a product that, for instance, engulfed and entrenched child labor somewhere in Africa simply because you are looking to have your Adidas shoe. So this really helps. It does help to ensure that during the whole supply chain, that the final product, and we know this, like for instance, when it comes to the gemstones industry, diamonds are our best friends to us women. So you've had situations where people have, you're wearing a diamond and you do not know that this diamond, a young boy was somewhere in an artisanal setup, and they're beaten up, and some even risks their life, and you're busy there wearing your diamond, you just collected it from Tiffany & Co. So what we are saying here is that once you exercise and once we conduct human rights due diligence, we protect right from the point of creation, from the point of extracting the raw material to the point of making it, to the point of distributing it to the end user. Of course, again, it does boost responsible buyer practices, like I mentioned. It is also, the exercise also brings mutual obligations that also foster collaborative efforts between the buyers and suppliers. And of course, you have an edge. If you're a business that complies with these due diligence laws and requirements, of course, you'll be competitive in the market. And also there's profitability, because once you're able to take care of your workers, for instance, if your suppliers are able to take care of their workers on the ground from where the materials are being sourced and processed, of course, there'll be increased productivity from the workers because they're able to work and they're happy working. So some of the challenges is, of course, limited bargaining power. Some of these suppliers they're looking to ensure that they maximize on the profit because maybe the buyer there's a markup. So if there are all these requirements, of course, all these due diligence requirements also equate to money. So it is important, of course, to balance that. And that's why I say that sorry about that. There can never be a perfect model. So of course, also one of the key issues of HRD, forced labor can be entrenched, especially where people are trying to comply with some of these things. External monitoring is also a challenge because we have media, we have NGOs also that are really critical in looking at this. We also have retailers, we have also the customer themselves, uncovering some of these unethical practices. So those are some of the challenges that would present themselves. We also have things like, if you're looking at workers, when we are having workers moving from one place to the other, in our country, for instance, in Kenya, we have very many people going into Saudi Arabia for work. You all know, for instance, there is the recruitment fee. So they not only pay fee in their host countries, but to the agencies in their host countries. But when they go and get to their employers, of course, there are other requirements that they're required to make payments to. And you'll find also their passports, their travel documentation is also withheld. This also brings in the huge recruitment cost because you cannot, perhaps it is withheld until you comply with the contract. And sometimes maybe even those contracts are not, they're not sufficient when it comes to the protection and preservation. So my parting shot for me, I would want to, everybody on call to take is that it's very critical to look at human rights due diligence process as an evolving, ongoing process. It is not a one-off. It's not one when you just do the reporting annually, but it is a continuous exercise that is proactive. There is very much space. There is a lot of opportunities that are presenting themselves when it comes to the area, when it comes to in-house lawyers within corporations, within companies, and also within law firms, within, you know, even the state agencies. It is a key area, and I think we should be able to embark on it. And I look forward to more and more sessions to unpack, because this was just but scratching the surface. Thank you very much, Madam Commissioner.
Thank you so much, Rebecca Wangui, for the very insightful presentation. And I hope the narrative that has been going around that human rights work is strictly for human rights practitioners, even commercial lawyers, in-house counsels. When you speak to issues of human rights due diligence, we have a role to play. You have mentioned to us about elements of human rights due diligence, and I agree with you that the process is quite technical, but you sharing the 4 elements that's assessing actual and potential risks, integrating risks and acting. Third is tracking the responses, and the same should be continuous. And lastly, communicating with stakeholders to promote accountability. You've also mentioned about issues on what the states, different governments have done in terms of putting in place processes and systems, the modern slavery laws, especially within the EU setup. We've spoken about legislation in California and what businesses, non-state businesses, can do to put in place measures that would promote responsible business practices. You've also mentioned the advantages and challenges associated with human rights due diligence. So colleagues, if you have any questions, you are free to indicate the same at the Q&A section. So our next speaker is Commissioner Bernard Mujuni. He is a commissioner at Equity and Rights under the Ministry of Gender, Labor and Social Development, Government of Uganda. He will speak to us the role of the duty bearer, what countries within the East African region have done to promote sustainable supply chains, including the rights of the vulnerable people, and what is the implementation status. I have just noticed I've received a communication that even Uganda has NAP. I was thinking it was only Kenya. So Uganda, Kenya has NAP, and Tanzania is on it. So in addition to this, what steps have governments taken to ensure that there is responsible, sustainable supply, so in the supply management? And you will also speak to us about the common human rights violations with global supplies, and whether there is a possibility for governments and even regional economic blocs such as the East African Community can establish a common understanding with the national and global businesses on supply chain responsibility, or each country is left on its own to manage the same. Thank you and welcome, Commissioner. Commissioner Bernard. Commissioner Bernard, as we wait to establish the position of commissioner, let's invite Council Sekanjo. I don't know if I'm pronouncing the name right, Sekanjako Abubakar, who is a legal practitioner based in Uganda. He's an associate partner at Lukwango and Company Advocates. We have heard from the previous speaker with regards to the global south, global north challenges in ensuring business and human rights are respected. We would want to hear from Abubakar what are the challenges of implementing the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights within East Africa community? Will you speak with regards to member countries and as a bloc? And the discussions of Global South, Global North. Yet we see global supply chain constituting a huge percentage of international trade. So with these geopolitical issues, the issue of having different laws and policies around supply chain, what are the challenges that we are likely to see in regulating the global supply chains? And what does this mean for supply chain responsibility? Welcome, Council.
Okay, thank you so much, Madam Moderator, and good evening, everyone who has joined the line. Let me take the opportunity to appreciate the East Africa Law Society for organizing this workshop, especially on the very pertinent issue of human rights and business. Of course, because we rely on business, especially for development, that's where even our governments draw revenue to run their affairs. So it is pertinent that we talk about this very important aspect and see how we advance forward. Well, my colleagues have dissected the matter. They have brought out a few of the challenges that are pertaining to this implementation. I will just dive in to demonstrate more challenges here and there that are legal, and of course, those are which are policy related. Allow me share my screen because that's where the presentation is. Okay. I hope you can see my presentation.
Unfortunately not. Try again and share the screen.
Okay, sorry. Okay. Yes, sorry about that. Okay, it's not working out. But I shared
so
it.
what you can do, yes, you can send it on email. You can send it to me on email, and then I will be in a position to help you project. But you can just, because of time, you can proceed with the session.
Okay, please. Okay, yeah, it's okay. It has failed, but let me forward it quickly here. Sorry, thought that I would be in position to share. First and foremost, the issue of the soft law, lack of a very clear law and enforceable legal regime relating to the business human rights has affected the enforcement. Because as we all know, that every time it remains a soft law, it becomes hard to go to court to seek for enforcement. So that possesses, that presents a challenge to the practitioners and even the litigants themselves, because there is no way you can pursue someone for violation of your right, which right is not clearly stipulated in any statutory instrument. The more we continue housing business human rights in various statutes, it limits its application and enforcement. And of course, we appreciate that some countries in East African community have come up with the national action plans, but these action plans remain mere aspirations if there are no enforcement mechanisms, if there is no any statutory instruments in that regard. So that pertains to the weak, that also leads us to weak institutional capacity, because our institutions, technically, you can only capacitate them to do something if there is a legal framework. But where there is no legal framework, they will continue hiding in the web of uncertainties to shun away from their obligation of ensuring enforcement. We have another point, which is about the uncoordinated efforts to ensure respect for human rights by business operations in the context of East African community. Because if you at this time, you just mention of Uganda and Kenya as the countries that have the national action plan, what is happening to the rest of other members of the East African community? So the approach, therefore, it leads to uncoordinated efforts. Therefore, you cannot ensure that there is a clear implementation of the UNGPs within the EC. Then you have the aspect of inadequate supervision of business operations for compliance with human rights standards. Here, I would give you the example because as I mentioned that this aspect of business human rights is housed in various laws. One of them is the Employment Act. The Employment Act, which provides for the labor-related rights, it provides for circumstances where the Commissioner for Labor can go out there and inspect maybe a factory. But now, how often does that happen? It rarely occurs. So, I mean, it therefore presents a challenge to the enforcement of the UNGPs within the East African community. Then you have the issue, the crisis of the knowledge gap on human rights-based approach in business operations. Well, I was doing some literature review. I realized that this is a growing field, and most of there is an organization that conducted research. That is the Frederick Ebert Siftang. It conducted a research in 2022, and it realized that just a very significant percentage of the people who are contacted knew about the business human rights approach. So that, of course, presents an issue regarding the enforcement, because there is no way you can enforce what you don't know. So in most cases, rights are violated, and those who would seek for remedy do not know what to do next. Even the practitioners have not taken the trouble to study and investigate this area. They are not interested. All they care more about are the commercial, transactions and the land matters. And then there are those, because you cannot discuss human rights and business without looking at the economies within which they work. So that takes us to the issue of the rule of law. Because when you talk about economy, when you talk about a country and its given governance, you're talking about the situation, the manner in which it is being governed. And that goes about the entire concept of the rule of law. So you cannot have business human rights thrive in a situation where you have a breakdown of the rule of law. And one of the aspects or the indicators that show that maybe there is a significant breakdown in the rule of law, and therefore a retarded development of the business human rights concept, is the issue of corruption. The Frederick Ebert Siftang, the Union Cooperation Office, conducted a survey and a study in 2022, and it got severe revealing findings, which indicated that DRC, at least 1.3 billion US dollars was lost in secret deals between businesses and government officials just between the 2010 and the 2012. In Kenya, they indicated that counterfeit medication worth billions of shillings were purportedly allowed into the country by corrupt practices involving traders and the pharmacists and the Poison Regulatory Board. In Uganda, 68 to 77 pharmaceutical workers had stolen and resold public procured drugs. So the drugs that were meant to be in the public facilities was stolen and sold on the black market to the private practitioners. So counterfeit drugs, they account for 50% of drug sales in sub-Saharan Africa, with fake pharmaceuticals accounting for between 30 to 60%. So this poses a danger because most of the deaths that occur relate to the drugs, the quality of the drugs we have, and the presence or the absence of the drugs. So now if you have corruption, and this is just one of the segments that is affected by corruption, but it goes ahead to affect so many other aspects of the society. So now this is just one component of the health, and you can see how devastating it is. So that is one of the aspects, one of the indicators that if there is a breakdown in the rule of law, in the way you deal with the corrupt officials, you cannot expect to have business human rights to thrive. Then you have the crisis of the illicit financial flows. Well, in however much you have the AU Convention on preventing and combating corruption, there are still some gaps. And the proceeds from corruption, they end up being converted, and of course, transfers, rather funds at times are transferred to different areas where it cannot be traced. In the past 5 years, 5 decades, Africa has lost close to 1 trillion, that is USD, to illicit financial flows. Why are we bringing out these figures? Of course, it is to show you that if we are talking about business, we look at the aspect of the commercial or the financial benefit we are likely to draw out of that. So you can see that the weak regulatory architectures of most African states are readily exploited by non-state actors, and such funds are drawn out of the economy. So there is no way you can pursue enforcement of human rights vis-a-vis implementation of the business if the proceeds of the business are drawn out of the economy. So you would expect that whatever we earn from the businesses is kept here, is invested, reinvested here, or it is taken out of our economy, in clear mechanisms so that we account, at least we derive a tax out of that. So that's why you end up having tax avoidances, tax evasion, concealment of wealth, and sidestepping of local levies and custom duties. So all that brings about a situation where human rights cannot be respected. Because the state, as the enforcer, you would expect it to be on the factories, to be on the neck of the investors on why they are not respecting human rights. But now they are in deals, they are in money-making deals to ensure that they squander the nations, to ensure that they take away the finances from our economies. So we have the issue of environmental pollution, and of course, the entire subject of the climate change. So as the East African community, so far we have not performed well in terms of approach. We have uncoordinated movements so far. In however much there are protocols in place to ensure that we tackle the aspect, the climate change. So for instance, we have in Uganda, the EACOP pipeline, the East African crude oil pipeline. It has been a very sticky issue for the last about 4 years, of course, regarding the compensation of the project affected people. So these persons were evicted without prior compensation. So they were left homeless, they were displaced, they were homeless, and the project had to continue. On top of that, there were issues also to do with the assessment, the environmental impact assessment, which was found to be lacking. Of course, I'm quoting the Climate Accountability Institute, which found that the construction alone would contribute to 1.8% of the full emission of the project. So meaning that this was going to be excessive, and it was going to exceed the emissions that would come out of almost the entire project of oil extraction in Uganda. So there were voices that came out, and many people ran to court to challenge this. But of course, the processes are still taking long. There is the crisis, of course, of delayed justice in some aspects, whereby some of the important and crucial matters that are taken to court and require immediate attention, they take forever. So this has been one of the issues. Environmental questions, they are some of the issues that have received a very slow approach by courts, and they have not really explored the different mechanisms of ensuring that environmental pollution is capped and that maybe the climate change is mitigated. On the issue of the displacements, well, it is not happening in Uganda alone. Someone mentioned about the case of the Ojik, where indigenous people were forcefully evicted from their ancestral land in the Mao forests. So those are some of the issues that are really cutting across. And the same is happening in Tanzania, of course, where the EACOP line, the pipeline is passing. There are still those environmental challenges and the issues to do with the displacement of project affected people. In Rwanda, you still have the same issues. Of course, the Rwandan National Commission for Human Rights identified the need to increase the commission's resources so as to ensure an effective and robust monitoring of respect for human rights in business. To this end, it is providing training to the private sector and trade unions on business and human rights. However, there are some challenges also that were mentioned in Rwanda, regardless of the efforts they are taking. Of course, they do not have the national action plan, and there are serious challenges regarding the extractive industries, that is the mining industries, the agribusiness, the horticulture, and there are also concerns that relate to child labor and degrading working conditions in agribusiness sector. I've mentioned to do, well, there are some case studies that have been presented from DRC. And of course, this one it is a very long, protracted issue, and it stems from the political economy. Of course, there are, as we all know, there have been political issues in some parts of Congo, and the impact has been on the illicit natural resource exploitation that has gone on for too long. So in that process, if they are illicit in that sense, you cannot expect such extraction or exploitation to be done with concern to human rights. And this has not only resulted in the pillaging of the country's extractive resources with the complicity of its political leaders, but has also led to severe rent-seeking practices. And of course, many countries in East Africa now, we have Congolese refugees in our own countries. So you can see that if you fail to put up a very strong and robust business human rights framework that protects and respect the human rights in the manner in which we do business, you end up having your people displaced and go out of the country looking for refuge and asylum. In Burundi, it is the same crisis. You have issues to do with women empowerment. Of course, the Committee on Elimination of Discrimination Against Women did some study and established that there were poor socioeconomic conditions, and of course, the limited access to credit by women, and unequal inheritance rights regarding the right to land tenure. So those are some of the issues that are really, really slowing down the implementation of the business human rights principles in East Africa. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Abubakar, for your presentation. It appears it's all gloomy in the sector on issues of human rights. You have shared with us what governments have done in terms of ensuring that businesses do respect human rights. But you have also mentioned the challenges, examples including scattered provisions in law on how businesses should protect human rights. Whereas countries have developed national action plan on business and human rights, they are merely in paper. So the implementation of NAP and coming up with legislative framework is a big challenge, and coordinated efforts by states and businesses, limited knowledge on business and human rights, that I agree with you. And the major issue which you have also highlighted is the rule of law. Corruption has really affected how we implement some of the laws that we have in the region. And I don't want to really speak to everything that you've mentioned, but another issue that caught my attention is delayed justice. You've highlighted examples where you have shared incidences of human rights violations in Uganda, DRC, Rwanda, Kenya. And I think participants would be in a position to, at the opportune time, research on those case studies and the issue of delayed justice. Maybe later, ELS would organize a webinar on UNGP pillar number 4, which is pillar number 3, sorry, which is known as the forgotten pillar, the issue of access to remedy. So I had introduced Commissioner Benjamin. I don't know whether he's available. Yes, Commissioner, please proceed with the presentation.
Hello, I don't know why every time I come in, there's a problem.
No, we can hear you now. Please proceed,
I hope
Commissioner.
we can sustain the...
I hope to.
Okay, thank you very much.
I hope that too, so please proceed.
Okay, thank you. I'll be quick to the point. One is that I want to appreciate the time and the resources for putting us together here. As already introduced, my name is Bernard Mishuni. I work with the Ministry of Gender, Labour and Social Development. I've been at the forefront of establishing the Equal Opportunities Commission in this country, but also rolling out implementation, development, and implementation of the National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights, which came out of UPR as Universal Periodic Review recommendation and all that. So the process has been really long, but we are glad today we got some grant support around 5 million euros from that notwithstanding, I think the government intervention is at 3 levels. It's at either policy or legal or regulatory, including guidelines or regulations. And then it's also at a programming level. It's about action plans and all that. Also much bringing the experience country, the practices on the ground. For such a long time, we've been attracting, and government has been focusing on private sector as the engine of growth, opening up the economy unlimited to all the investors of all sorts of kind. And as such, we've focused on the physical infrastructure, including capital, industrialization, roads, energy, at the expense of social infrastructure. Now, social infrastructure involves services, health, education, the people, actually the people. And now the issue is there is need for a balancing scale. We've had, in a bid to attract investment, we've had tax waivers, tax holidays for investors. First of all, by guaranteeing, I don't know how much billions I could get them, quickly, but Uganda's tax holiday for some private investors is almost $1 billion. And this is a lot of money. But these are the same people who come into the market to compete in terms of trade. And this is already, you don't pay tax, but you're utilizing the same services and putting pressure on the economy. I think that's the biggest violation of human rights you can imagine. But that notwithstanding, we know that heavy investments have come in terms of oil and gas. I also look at the expense of human beings and the expense of human rights. In Uganda, we have had experiences with Karuma Dam, one of the biggest East African hydro power dam. And you've had migrant labor coming in from different countries. And at the same time, we've had issues to do with social safeguards. I also work as a contact person on social safeguards for World Bank in the ministry. And as such, I'm involved in a lot of project design and social impact assessment, social risk management issues, and which are human rights issues. So, for example, in Karuma, you have instances where you have had Ugandans of Chinese origin, but without fathers, after conceiving and all that. The contractor repatriates the labor and leaves the expectant children, the expectant mothers in a crisis of parenthood. And now these are the issues that we talk about passionately, but we have also witnessed. We have also had issues where large-scale investments have displaced people, or investors have actually been leased out natural resources which would benefit the communities. Some of you who have heard about this country, there was a case of a company called Fedesalt Engineering Services at a greater risk. But this is public information. It leased out in Kavalole, it leased out 40 crater lakes, 40 plus crater lakes for fishing. And people in Kampala were enjoying go fish everywhere, not knowing that actually the communities have been locked out of access. Water serves as a source of water, but it's a source of livelihood and other human rights, and in form of identity, culture, tangible and intangible, memory. Other communities couldn't fish. The company was rearing fish in those lakes, but there was already fish. People were saying, but before you came, we used to get fish. So this is, but fortunately, I think the situation went back, and that is after he had done environmental and social impact assessment, and authorities had approved the whole thing. So these are issues of impunity that we are talking about in terms of business and human rights. I will not reiterate the principles of the National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights about protection, promotion, or access to remedy in terms of rights violation. The previous speakers have already exhausted the topic. But I want to also reiterate the fact that for you to, as government, we need to look at responsible investment and investment with a human face. And this takes out into the value chain. You look at the issue of telecom. For example, telecom industry and telecommunications has been growing almost at 22% per annum in this country. But you find that most of the work, like call centers, some of the work now is being outsourced. You have issues to do with the telecom industries here outsourcing even call centers. Call centers are largely here were being managed by humans, and the young people would be in the call center. You have issues, but now they're being outsourced up to China, up to India, and this labor and jobs migration. And yet these people are getting income and their capital and profits from here, and also expropriate and repatriating almost entire profit. And that's where we have got it wrong. Most of these companies are not even listed on the stock market for people to have a stake in, and yet they are multi-billion companies. For sure, this, we need to look at it from the human rights perspective. Is that really fair? There are issues to do with inclusive trade policies. You've had, as a government, you need to, as a region, East Africa, we need to look at non-tariff barriers. We've had issues where between Uganda and Kenya, and the milk and the maize, and use of aflatoxins to deny and to twist and all that, and it has been very, very unfair. We had issues to do with the oil and pipeline, and you see how acrimonious the whole process was. I'm twisting. And I think we need to candidly support the development of fair and inclusive regional trade policies and avoid non-tariff barriers. There is also common standardization and application of digital seals. Accessing some of these means that we have to develop common standards. I've had instances. Personally, I participated in the negotiation of the common markets on the common markets protocol on free movement of goods and services. Now we are activating again the same debate. But I can tell you there's a lot of double standards in this. You find Uganda has been very hospitable to different people. But when you go to practice, for example, human resource in Kenya, you cannot unless you are a Kenyan. But in Uganda, anyone can be a human resource manager in different entities. I think human rights is about, and business is about opening up businesses for people to explore their full potential. And you shouldn't limit it only to corporate personalities or corporate persons or entities, but also to the individuals practicing their skill. We still have issues to do with practicing law across the region. You know, barriers, professional barriers, surveyors, engineers, they should be judged on a common standard and codification. I think that opens up the whole potential of the region. Of course, we have had issues to do with cybersecurity. Cybersecurity in common transboundary crimes, you know, or recently Equity Bank, with due respect, has had standards with due respect to cybercrime and application of the law across the region. We need to harmonize some of these areas so that one person shouldn't take refugee into another country upon committing some of these crimes. We've had issues where people have they ran up to Southern Sudan. Yet this is East Africa. They ran up to, you know, Eastern Congo, you know, but should you know, our government is legislating on cyber security. They were focusing much more on control, on civil and political-economic crimes are very central in terms of appropriation, in terms of human rights abuse, in terms of illicit transfer of money and loot. Investing in technology, governments, I think there is something to do with the accountability here, and as an enabler in terms of governance and accountability and fighting corruption. But this, I think, we need to focus largely on the rights-based to internet. When we had COVID, the right to access internet, the right to free internet should be now a fundamental right. Actually, we should be advocating for this right to be part of the Bill of Rights in different constitutions that we have. I don't think we had, the way we had access to information is not necessarily the same with access to internet. You see, internet, I think the Internet of Things is the big thing now that we need our governments to be held accountable. This way, you unlock potential. And you have had instances. For example, Uganda, Facebook is not free. I mean, it's out of reach with so many other barriers. It's not allowed to be, for lack of a better word. Remember, work with government. So, and young people have been selling their stuff, merchandise, you know, everywhere. Small entrepreneurs have been budding up through Facebook, even now that it is not allowed to operate here because of so many other issues and violations and disagreements with government. Young people find their way of upstarting livelihoods by selling online. And that's the only marketplace which is not having that. And I want to quickly that starting a business should be almost, before you start, young people here in terms of business and human rights cannot easily start enterprises. Before you start, they are requesting for you to have a National Social Security Fund registration. Before you start, they want a TIN tax identification number. Before you start, then you've got to have premises where you are supposed to be. Before you start, then. So which acts as barriers to enterprise growth and realizing the right to entrepreneurship and practice business for young people? It's a barrier for entry into the market. And then we need to look at workforce development through the supply chain and sustainability. We'll talk about climate smart and tapping into the blue economy and looking at and young people, especially the young people. I work with young people. They are locked out of the market economy or labor market or capital market economy because the soft economy, which is tourism, blue internet, access to, social media and all that, is there in thing. But we have over-regulated, we have over-tightened up because of civil and political rights, and thereby denying them economic and entrepreneurship right, for lack of the word, rights, for lack of a better word. I think we need to have a reality check. The cultural appropriation of the different speakers have talked about, appropriation, exploitation, the illicit trade in, blood, gold, blood, diamond, timber in Congo, even in this country itself, climate, causing even climate disasters that are coming up. As someone who is in this area, I've witnessed a lot of cultural appropriation. Even when it comes to valuations, actually compensation in large-scale investment infrastructure, compensation does not take into account the tangible and intangible culture. Okay, they look at tangible culture if they are graves actually and visible, but intangible culture, which is form of social capital, breaking social capital does not attract value in terms of compensation. Yet for women, most women actually, when you reshift or resettle them from one group, from one area to another, either because of disaster or because of infrastructure development, you break down their social capital. They can no longer save together. And they cannot start afresh to build trust. Relationship takes time. When people with disabilities are broken, their social ties are broken and you resettle them, they suffer because they cannot find a very accommodative, inclusive community that has been helping them. Most of our communities, you have seen people with disabilities, those who cannot, who have wheelchairs, they don't have paid up assistance. They get the community to push them around in the church, in the market, in town, climb the hill, go down. It's a community. It's a community. Children help them. But if you resettle them and you don't pay for that, then that means they have lost their rights, but also violated their rights, but their livelihood is totally shattered. The same with women who go to the well. When you hear them laughing down the valley, it's not because they are, it's because there's a lot of psychosocial support. When someone says, oh, my husband beat me, oh, what do you do? Oh, what did you do? That is counseling. If you shift them, you pay for that service. So I'm saying that actually in East Africa, there's nowhere, even in terms of international standards, where valuation of that intangible culture has taken effect. And as such, the infrastructure projects appropriate that in terms of returns, in terms of profit. It makes profit out of it. And the saving anyway, yeah. But now there's also issues to do with these inadequate resources. There is actually, in terms of infrastructure development and business, you can travel all the way from Nakuru, all the way from Mombasa. You won't find purpose-built resting places alongside the entire ecosystem of infrastructure. And that is a big, big problem. That's why you have accidents, because people actually sleep, trailer drivers. They sleep while driving. There's no purpose-built resting places or even areas where you can take a shower or even a nap, other than, small town centers, in Uganda. And these have been epicenters for HIV, AIDS, for crime, for all that kind of stuff. And so we've engaged Uganda Road Ministry of Works, and to make sure that every infrastructure alongside the value chain of infrastructure must have purpose-built spaces or safe spaces for long-term drivers, for you who are traveling up country, who are driving up country to fast rest, to charge. I've seen the equivalent of my own grandmother while traveling up country. The bus just stopped on the roadside, and an old woman, opened up behind, and she was busy easing herself in the grass. How long shall we denigrate? How long shall we violate the rights of our people? And, this is inhuman and degrading. It's degrade the dignity of our own people, simply because we can't provide for some of these safe spaces. Everyone just jumps out of the bus and the taxi and eases themselves anyhow in the bush. Can you imagine in this day and age this is happening? And no sooner had I witnessed that I also got pressed. I also got pressed, but mine was not a bad one. On the light moment, and for men it is more convenient than ladies. Actually, snake can bite you while trying to ease yourself in the bush because you're just imposing yourself. Oh my God, it's terrible. And these are things which we talk about, and our policymakers must listen to. And we've advanced this discussion. As a country, we developed the National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights. Yes, we have rolled it out. Yes, but also we have developed it has led to the development of the Social Impact Assessment and Accountability Bill, which is supposed to be Human Rights Impact Assessment and Accountability Bill. But unfortunately, we have the challenge to do with the National Environment Management Authority, which is now opposing the law, thinking they are going to touch on their mandate, comfort zones. And this is the thing that is where government needs to wake up. The government is owned. I think that it also has to do with state capture. When people stay for long in some of these institutions, and they think that institutions are actually theirs, and someone comes in, even if they are successors, they also want to protect what the other one was. I think there's a problem in terms of governance and accountability. As the East African Law Society, we need your support in this. I've already engaged the Uganda Law Society. We are working together. I've presented before them a lot of issues, and including this law. I share with them for Uganda. We need it for natural resource dependent and other indigenous minorities, and even when the court, there was a clear decree that stopping National Wildlife Authority. Again, there was clear violation of that judgment and ruling, and I think it is quite very unfair. But what I'm saying is that yes, we can do a lot to change the paradigm, the landscape. Most of us here, especially in this country, when you talk so much about human rights, people think about labor laws and business. They think about labor laws. They think about workers, contracts. No, they think about child labor. No, it's about environment. It's about governance. It's about responsible investments. It's about tax payment, taxes, taxation, and fair and equitable tax regime. It's also about business landscape. Do you get contracts fairly? There are people here who have been found in the habit of procuring contracts. There are people who are specializing in getting contracts. I don't know how. That one you don't ask me, because I come from this side of the mountain. But there are some people who are also specializing in buying those contracts. They buy them off the market as if it is a stock market. And to me, that is also holding the country at ransom. And it's another level of corruption, which takes away the entire value system. I think the ESGs are very, very important, environmental and social governance, even for non-hardcore, non-capital intensive investments like banks, like insurance. There are these companies which are huge in terms of portfolio, but they don't think the impact on the environment. It's about dams, it's about roads. No, I think we need to make it very universal that environment and human rights social governance should apply across the entire value chain of business, corporate entities. And there, it makes business sense for them to report on human rights, fundamental human rights, and from the rights-based perspective, not disguising it as economics, as, social, governing, environment, and then abusing the generosity of this country, of these countries in East Africa by manipulating the corporate social responsibility to enhance brand equity. This has been happening. You mobilize the entire run. Is it Kabaka run? Is it run for Karamoja? Run Masai? Run for what? You actually make a profit out of corporate social responsibility. And the only thing that you can do for the community is the borehole. You've generated like 5 billion Uganda shillings or $2 million in terms of revenue, but you've just delivered one borehole because you identified with the cause which everyone bought into. But nothing of any substance has been delivered to the communities. I think this is where we need to come in. They are moving back in terms of, and finally, I want to rest this case that we have issues to do with the recovery issues in oil and gas. I've been a labor inspector for some good time as Assistant Commissioner for Labor Inspectorate. And I know what happens in oil and gas industry in the recoverable costs. They have been moving up to the level that threatens whether actually oil and gas you have already mortgaged up. And the earlier we run the refinery, the more we look at it for the countries which have discovered some of these have been, so we need to look at this country. In Uganda, for example, the Auditor General raised a lot of concerns with recoverable costs, and which is very, very, very good. But you see, it takes a mind of someone who becomes conscious that, yes, these countries, East Africa and Uganda in particular, has adequate resources for everyone to move out of poverty. But the problem is how to equitably share these resources and allocate the same. I think, thank you so much. We need to look at fintech as my parting shot. Fintechs are coming in, everyone is jumping in, but we need to look at them from the rights perspective. What are they helping out, or are they taking advantage of unsuspecting, excited populace? So we haven't focused so much on fintechs, but it is an exciting area that is opening up the business space and human rights participation of different communities. Thank you so much, and for the opportunity. I hope the internet has allowed me finally to
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Commissioner. Even one of the participants mentioned that you are speaking from your heart. You're painting real life picture. So thank you so much. You have highlighted to us what states are doing within the region in terms of policy, legislative, regulatory, and implementation mechanism to ensure that businesses and human rights, businesses do respect human rights. You have also shared with us the challenges, and just allow me to highlight a few. The issue of the social safeguards. You have mentioned examples of parental responsibilities, and I think this one cuts across. You're speaking about the Karuma Dam, and in Kenya, we speak about the Thika Road Highway, where we were left with children of Chinese origin. Issues of large-scale land-based investments and evictions, responsible value chains, inclusive trade policies, cybersecurity. You have actually highlighted quite a number of issues which I know members would relate to. The issue of building purpose-built resting places. I saw that brought about a lot of reactions, because I think a number of us would relate to that. Yet as a regional economic bloc, you're saying that we have to ensure that businesses are run smoothly and businessmen and women are accorded the dignity they deserve. But particularly what has caught my attention is business and human rights should be looked beyond labor laws. We need to look at governance structures, taxes, generally the business landscape within our respective countries, and also as a regional economic bloc, that is the East African Law Society. So we have overshot our time by 23 minutes. I'll allow each panelist, before we go to question and answers, to just make a general comment to the participants in 1 minute. So we have heard about different frameworks within the national, regional, and national, and at the national level, national, international, regional, and national level on issues around business and human rights, and the UNGPs, which provide for a vertical and horizontal application of human rights within our countries. When I was at FYD, I did visit a big company. I don't want to mention the name. And they informed me that they are particularly interested in ensuring that all suppliers are members of the Global Compact, because they are interested in ensuring that their suppliers, including lawyers, are members of the UN Global Compact. So as lawyers, we are service providers. We also need to find a way of upping our game. So allow me to start with Abu Bakar. And when you're responding to this particular panel issue, I would request that you respond to a question raised by Rashid Wekesa. So I want you to tell the participants, based on the presentation that you have shared, how can lawyers as businesses and as service providers effectively promote accountability within the supply chain, and respond to Richard Wekesa on the question that the UN system is tackling ground violations, how the UN system is tackling ground violations such as big oil company violations. We must be alive to the fact that our states are puppets of such companies. So Abu Bakar, please proceed and respond to that question and give your insights to lawyers in a minute.
Okay, thank you so much. I thank you for allowing me the opportunity to talk to colleagues. Well, that is a very broad question that I cannot effectively answer within a minute, but I will share my presentation. It has some bit of recommendations at the end, and some of the issues I responded there to. But the UN system has a very broad framework within which you can raise your issue and, of course, seek a remedy. And especially before maybe you even approach the UN, I believe that you can first explore the local remedies. In however much we are having this discussion at the international framework, I believe that there are internal mechanisms that can enable us explore those remedies. For instance, in Uganda, it is something that the courts of law have been really appreciating. They have been applying this principle. In however much sometimes they do not state it outrightly that we are applying the business human rights approach, but you realize that in some of the decisions that are coming out, they are a bit subconscious and sensitive about it. Then, of course, we need to explore the regional frameworks, maybe the East African Court of Justice, and then there is a framework through which you can access the African Court on Human and People's Rights. Then there is a framework through which you can access the UN organs, including the ICJ and the UN Security Council. Of course, on the aspect of our states being puppets, that's a sticky one. I may not comment on that. It is your personal view, but I believe that our states are sovereign in their own way, and we can stand our ground and promote our local remedies, because that is also important, taking into the aspect of our struggles for independence, financially, and of course politically and socially. So that is something that we can explore and see that we develop our own mechanisms, of course, without losing the focus, on the main framework. Thank you so much. Let us pursue the remedies available and interest ourselves so much into public interest litigation. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you very much, Abubakar. Commissioner Bernard, you mentioned about organizations manipulating CSR. So there's a question from Tabu Kumoi. I need to know how corporate social responsibility intersects with human rights. And when you're responding to that question, please share with the lawyers your insights on how they can effectively promote accountability within the value chains. Just in a minute, because of time.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think there's no size fitting it all. One size does not fit it all. I think we need to be vigilant. First of all, we need to take up.
Sorry, Commissioner, your internet is not stable.
Public initiative, but then from citizens. Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes, yes.
Yeah, I was saying that witchcraft might be working. I'm saying that yes, from the public, from legal position, you can do public interest litigation, but also in terms of whistleblowing, as lawyers, we work with civic, and this is where social lawyering is very, very important. If you are running your chambers from the traditional way, law is supposed to be practiced, then you are way behind the digital revolution. You need to digitalize, you need to be accessible, you need to be engaging in public without necessarily violating the ethical standards. But you need to be also active. You've seen chambers here, law chambers, taking up a public interest issue because the Wananchi are scared of the repercussions and state retaliation. But from the public policy perspective, we need to work with media, civil society to highlight some of these issues. They give you the voice where you can be, because you cannot stay. And I saw this during recently. I've been appointed by African Development Bank to mediate the matter in which an irrigation scheme was so insensitive to community value chain, human rights, and the people rose up and burnt the tractors and the machinery. And I've been approached, and we've had community engagement meetings. I can tell you, if you worked with the civil society, they can give you a better landscape. It doesn't harm you. There's no law that says that chambers shouldn't work with popular civil society organizations to raise up the plight of the vulnerable people in the value chain. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Commissioner. Very insightful. We need to move out of our desks and engage the public. Ms. Rebecca Wangoi, please, let's have your feedback with regards to the insight for lawyers. And if you have anything with regards to the two questions that have been raised, you're allowed to respond to the same.
Thank you very much, Madam Commissioner, once again. A quick one on the corporate social responsibility vis-a-vis human rights. What, of course, we all acknowledge is that the CSR is self-guided, and there's also, it's voluntary by companies, and it is also based on what they decide that they would give the communities. And as you well know, that anything goes for CSR, in my humble opinion. So for instance, if you're in Turkana and you're busy there exploring their oil, and you decide that a school just requires a toilet, and you just quickly go and dig a toilet, there is no water infrastructure there, it is still labeled as CSR. So what we are talking about here is going beyond what companies think people need, so that as part of their philanthropic exercise to human rights, which is actually binding, because human rights are no longer norms, are no longer practices. Human rights, every country out there is supposed to amalgamate all these international legal frameworks into their national laws. So there's a very big difference. And of course, even while some companies do exercise CSR, it is out, in my view, it is a subset of the bigger picture, because CSR also looks at more of the social angle of the community and human beings. But when you talk about human rights, you're talking about their political space, their political right to speak out. You're talking about the economic rights. You're talking about the social rights, as our panelist Bernard Munjini has really expounded. That was very insightful. So lawyers, as human rights specialists, as governance experts, this is a very big space that has very much opened up for us in the region. Let me call about like East Africa region. And I also want to really give a big thank you to our panelist, Patrick Karanja, who has been mainstreaming business and human rights together with the East Africa Law Society, and also with Kenya National Commission on Human Rights, where our Madam Commissioner sits. I think this coordinated efforts will no longer not just look at us as people who are participating in the global arena, but we actually are practicing the principles. And so as lawyers, kindly, it is an opportunity for us to begin to have conversations within our law firms, for instance, on having a desk, a specialized individual, or even somebody just within there. You could be a corporate lawyer, it doesn't matter. Human rights is something that is very adaptable along the way. Any person within the institution that has that interest to further this course, to just mainstream this area, and so that once they mainstream that within the law firms, they'll be able to now even be able to handle and address needs as and when corporate transactions or corporate investments are taken up by the companies. Of course, we have in-house lawyers in banks. This will be very critical, and I think they're doing that. We've had so many in-house counsels who've attested to them actually going for human rights education sessions. This is really, really encouraging, and I'm very much encouraged because we are now moving to human rights being actually a very critical area of our practice. Thank you very much for this opportunity. Asanteni sana, the participants, for according us also your audience and time. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rebecca. Patrick, for your insights also to the lawyers. And I've seen Beatrice Chelagat mention that ESG reporting can be used to monitor human rights violations. So Patrick, you can also speak to that and your insights to the lawyers.
Thank you, Madam Moderator, Commissioner Jacqueline. First of all, to thank you for convening us today. And in a very special way, to thank you for being the person who started this movement as my predecessor, as a project leader at Advocates for International Development. We started collaboration with the East African Law Society to create awareness on UNGPs. And I'm happy to see the culmination of these years of efforts that business and human rights has now been recognized by the East African Law Society as one of the areas of practice for lawyers in East Africa. My rally call would be for us as an action point as lawyers, and we are called learned friends because we're able to contextualize everything and be social engineers. For me, my first call is for us to familiarize ourselves with the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. It's a very small book, 31 principles, about 35 pages. Apparently, you can read it in about 1 hour, and it opens your mind in terms of how can you incorporate this in your legal practice. And also working from the perspective that the UNGPs are internationally agreed to be a framework on what is the business responsibility on human rights, having been unanimously adopted by the UN Human Rights Council in 2011. So as lawyers, let us familiarize ourselves with the framework and the principles in the UNGPs so that we know what is the state duty to respect human rights, how can we support and hold our governments and systems accountable. What is the responsibility of business? How can we advise our corporate clients, either as lawyers, commercial law firms, or in-house counsel, to ensure that they incorporate human rights in their business operations? And thirdly, as lawyers, to ensure that we're able to support individuals and communities to access remedy in case of human rights violation caused by businesses. If you look at websites of most of the leading global law firms, you realize that business and human rights is actually one of their leading area of practice. My dream is that we can replicate that in East Africa, and we can establish business and human rights practice in our law firms. And to give you a head start, FOID and the East Africa Law Society, last year we developed an e-learning course on business and human rights, which has 4 modules on international and regional frameworks, human rights due diligence, and ESG, and human rights, business and human rights, and what opportunities are there for lawyers. So reach out to the East Africa Law Society and engage with us. We would be happy to share the resources we have so that we can know how to make business and human rights a reality and a real agenda in our countries. And finally, I would say, as lawyers, we can leverage on courts to take matters where the UNGPs and the international framework on business and human rights can be interpreted. I think precedents and court rulings can be a powerful tool for us to create more buzz about business and human rights, because even courts will be able to tell legislatures where the legislative gaps are. So, and I know most of the public interest litigation in the past was focused on civil and political rights. I think we can renovate and do more business and human rights strategic litigation so that we can create a buzz, and companies can become aware that they actually have human rights obligations. And finally, just to thank ELS for the opportunity and my fellow panelists, and to wish everyone a good day, hoping to see you more in more BHR engagements.
Thank you. Thank you. There are still questions that may arise, so you can't tell us Kwaheri. So lastly, Aki, what are your insights, share your insights that would interest lawyers in the issue of business and human rights? And then I see Caroline Kasoa's hand is up, and any other participant with a question, please raise your hand and the Secretariat will allow you to respond to the question. Over to you, Aki.
Thank you very much once again. It's always difficult speaking the last one because everything has been said. But besides that, I think I can start with the point raised by Beatrice, where she says that ESG reporting should be used to monitor human rights violations. And really, it's a good point. Just to note that in the Nairobi Securities Exchange right now, listed companies are required to make ESG disclosures, which I think is a good step in the right direction. In terms of our position as lawyers, what can we do to further the protection of human rights? I would say that as lawyers, first, we need to remember that one of our core obligations is to the public, and we need to protect the public. That means that we need to champion human rights, and not just in litigation. My colleagues have spoken about other avenues that we can use. I think I'll start from the point that Patrick has said, that we need to read and understand the UNGPs. But I would also further that and say that aside from reading, we should also be very keen about publishing around topical issues on business and human rights. I think that can help in development, not just creating awareness, but also in terms of development of jurisprudence, be it in a small way. Another role that we can play, which I would say is preventative rather than reactionary, is providing advisory to our clients. This is something that we do at IBIS Consulting, but I would also encourage lawyers to do that. Let's advise our clients around respect for human rights, because sometimes you find it's a matter of ignorance. They are violating human rights out of ignorance. We can also support them in developing policies to guide their operations so that they are not violating human rights. And aside from that, we can provide them with the trainings also, so that they, again, do not violate human rights. But aside from doing policy development at the company level or at the client level, we can also extend this to the national level, participating in international processes where we can be able to voice human rights issues affecting us. And this can be picked up and probably addressed at the international stages. Rebecca spoke about the human rights due diligences. I'll also add human rights impact assessments. These are very good tools that we can use in terms of building a base for evidence in case we will ever want to do litigation in the future. And lastly, around litigation, let us not litigate in a cocoon. Let us also liaise with our colleagues in international jurisdictions, rather other jurisdictions, in order to see how we can further the protection of human rights. I mean, a Kenyan lawyer can work with a lawyer based in the UK if at all they would want to invoke extraterritorial jurisdiction and sue a company that is violating human rights within their jurisdiction. They would always come to us as lawyers for advice about our laws, and then now go and do the litigation in their own countries. So I think those are some of the ways that we can work together towards promotion of human rights. And I think at this point, I'll just close by saying thank you very much to the ELS for organizing this. And I hope we have many more conversations around this, because the more we have them, the more we mainstream human rights within the context of business. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Aki. So we have Caroline Kasoas, whose hand is up. Caroline, kindly unmute and ask your question. And once you're done, we can go to Chuma Onyekwelu. I hope I have pronounced your name right.
Good afternoon, Madam. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Council Caroline.
Yes, I'm sorry I'm in a bit of a noisy place, but allow me to just ask one question and give a comment. The question I would ask the wonderful panelists, by the way, thank you very much. When I saw this webinar, I saw it just like 1 hour ago. And I was like, hey, if Jackie is holding a webinar, it will be lit. Let me join. So thank you very much, the panelists and the host. So my question is, what can we do through this initiative that we can build lawyers' prowess to develop better pleadings for appropriate remedies? Because I see sometimes judges are very desperate. They wish something was pleaded so that they can give a remedy which has more impact and better impact. And our reliance on precedents is something that is also a challenge, so that we can come up with more innovative pleadings that comply with the UGP. That is the first time I'm hearing that name. So I believe I'll go and search about it, but can be more impactful on human rights. And I'm also happy that now we are coming up with human rights due diligence. And the last speaker said, I think this is a challenge to all the law societies. Let us take this thing and run with it on human rights compliance assessment. That is a very, very robust practice area. Yes, and the other comment which I is that what can this society?
Carol, we've lost you. Is it just me or I can't hear Caroline? Aki, can you hear Caroline? Or
No, we've lost her. I cannot hear her.
okay, so we could then go to Chekuma.
Hello. Did you hear
yes,
my
now,
first?
okay, yes. Okay, no,
Did
the
you
first one
hear
we
my
did, the
first
second
part
one.
of the comment?
Yes, the first part we did. So kindly repeat the second part.
The second part is, what can this program do with the country law societies so that we can have even public interest litigation in all the partner countries, but with partnership of lawyers in all the countries. And I'm not just meaning that the law societies at the headquarters, I'm also thinking the law societies in the branches. Because when you educate from the down and then you educate the top, we might have a better impact. And what can we do to build the law society's capacity to come up with the human rights defenders units? Thank you. I'll leave it there.
Okay. Thank you very much, Caroline. I know you're usually passionate on these issues, and your passion can only be matched by that of Bernard. Chikuma, kindly, let's have your question.
Hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I don't have a question. I want to express appreciation for the wonderful presentations that I've listened to. I joined you from Nigeria. So Nigeria is in West Africa. So
At least know that, yeah.
So the experiences they shared and everything are almost what we are observing here. So I'm delighted that it seems across Africa we are having the same experience, and there are people working on solutions. So thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you for the positive comments. Yeah, we know where Nigeria is, and I know in school we learned about the unfortunate Ogoni case and how the African Commission was able to issue certain orders with regards to the violation. So thank you so much for joining us, and hopefully next time we are going to do a joint session for the 2 regional economic blocks, so that we can have lawyers exchange ideas. So Aki, could you respond to Carol's question on how we can engage lawyers so that we have innovative way of drafting pleadings? Because among the issues judges have is they would really want to give orders, but how these pleadings are drafted is a problem. So you could, in 1 minute, respond to that, and also Patrick, I know there was this peer-to-peer learning FYD had, so the 2 of you could respond to that one.
Thank you very much. So in my opinion, one of the best ways of drafting pleadings first is to understand, sorry, my video is acting up. I don't know if I'm able to put it up. No, I'm not able to. Yeah. So, but one of the best ways of getting to draft pleadings first is to understand the law and to understand the issues. So I think we really need to focus on ourselves learning and understanding business and human rights, the principles that are there, and then we can be able to apply them in drafting. We also need just to read widely and understand. I think that's what I would say basically, because you can't draft what you do not understand. You can't submit on what you do not understand, and to understand that you need to read widely. Maybe we can have more and more conversations about this, where we get to train, discuss, and train lawyers also on some of these issues. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Aki. Patrick?
Thank you, Madam Commissioner. This reminds me of a study commissioned by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, which noted that there are only 2 cases in Africa, one in South Africa and a labor matter in Kenya, that mentioned the UNGPs. So perhaps the best thing is to start getting the UNGPs mentioned so that the courts can also start asking, what is this UNGP about? And for the Kenyan National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights, there's actually an action point on how to engage the Human Rights Division in promoting and developing the business and human rights in the region. And I understand where Council is coming from, because I know when a matter lands in court, the court will ask, should this be in the commercial? Are you talking about land? Should it be? How do we make this a human rights conversation? So I think this is a ripe conversation for national bar associations, and in Kenya, the Law Society of Kenya, the Public Interest, Legal Aid and Human Rights Committee, to start thinking, how do we advance those conversations in the court corridors so that even when the judge hears it, they are more curious and they know how to expand or to develop jurisprudence to fit the business and human rights, because it is an emerging jurisprudence.
Okay, thank you. There's Beatrice Chelagat's question. I would request that Rebecca responds to it. How can lawyers leverage on e-procurement and mandatory reporting obligation in SCM to monitor human rights violations? Rebecca? Or Aki, could you respond to it? Seems
I'll take a pass on that because I don't think I understand what SCM is, and
okay.
I do not want to give wrong feedback.
Okay. So I think I have read out most of my appreciation. So yeah, just appreciation. So as a moderator, I'm happy that we've had a fruitful engagement. Caroline Hasoa, I do agree with you that we need to start the discussions at our bar associations. And I know ELS has taken up this comment. As a region, we have a common law and a civil law jurisdiction. So it is important, whereas we are discussing this thing at the regional economic block session, we need to ensure that we cascade the discussions at our local bars and the very, very, very local bars. That's the regional and chapter level. So I'm hopeful that the ELS has taken note of this. And as a member of the Business and Human Rights Committee, I will follow up on the same. So colleagues, we have overshot our time by about 54 minutes. Allow me to end the session and remind us that we need to appraise ourselves with the developments around the business and human rights sector. Let's read the UNGPs. I'm also aware that at the AU level, there is a draft policy on business and human rights. Let's familiarize ourselves. And if we are in spaces that can push for its adoption, let's do the same. Kenya, Uganda, we have the National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights. Let's also familiarize ourselves and see how we can engage in the implementation of the same. Kenya is also developing a due diligence framework. So advocates, let's engage in the process and let's continue litigating. Let's engage, let's exchange ideas so that we bring to courts well-drafted petitions, and beyond courts, let's advise our clients on the need to respect human rights. Let's assist them develop policies and systems that will ensure that human rights are protected. It was a pleasure being your moderator, and thank you so much, the panelists, for a very insightful session. The presentations would be available on email for all the attendees, and you can also, for those that had the PowerPoint presentations, the same will be available on our emails. You will also be in a position to view the recordings through the YouTube channels, and I can only wish you a wonderful afternoon. Let's keep the fire burning. Let's all know that we have a duty to ensure that human rights are protected and respected all the time. Thank you so much, and God bless you.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Thank you.
much.